Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the head of the World Trade Organization, said that the U.S. administration's support of waiving intellectual property rights for COVID-19 vaccines will give an impetus to address global vaccine inequality. The WTO Director General made the remarks at a virtual conference organized by the European University Institute in Florence on Friday. She also said that while over 100 developing countries have joined South Africa and India in demanding the IP waiver, other countries have expressed concerns that such a move would disincentivize research and innovation. She called for member states to sit down and negotiate.
They are proponents of the intellectual property waiver. Over 100 developing countries have joined South Africa and India in asking for the waiver because they believe it's material to access for developing countries to solve the vaccine inequity issue. But there are also proponents, as you've said, on the other side who believe that the IP waiver may not be the critical issue for increasing volumes. So my job is to make sure that I bring members together to actually sit down and negotiate text that would lead to a pragmatic solution that assures access to developing countries to deal with the vaccine inequity, whilst at the same time making sure we don't disincentivize research and innovation. So that's where we are. The recent pronouncements by the US and so on, I'm sure will give an impetus to the negotiations with people, members being willing to come around the table to negotiate text. That's the only way we'll make progress. There are several factors needed to solve the problem of access inequity for vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. And WTO can play a role in all of them and is playing a role. One is reducing export restrictions and prohibitions so that supply chains can work easily for both final products as well as raw materials and supplies. We also need trained personnel for manufacturing. Then we need to increase manufacturing capacity. 80% of the world's exports of vaccines is concentrated in 10 countries in North America, South Asia, and Europe. And we've seen the problems with that concentration now. So we also need to use either idle capacity in emerging markets and developing countries that is available now and can be turned around in the next 6 to 9 months, and put in new capacity. For instance, Africa, a continent of 1.3 billion people, imports 99% of its vaccines. So I think something needs to be done to improve manufacturing on that side.
German Chancellor Angela Merkel has weighed in against the U.S. proposal to waive patent protections for COVID-19 vaccines. The German government spokeswoman in an email said the U.S. plan would create severe complications for the production of vaccines. Without the incentives of profits from research and development spending, drug makers might not move as aggressively to make vaccines in the future. Reports suggest some tier 1 banks are among a list, that's in Nigeria, are among a list of financial institutions from Africa and even in the Middle East, indicating interest in the acquisition of Atlas Mara's assets, Atlas Mara's assets as it looks to exit the African continent. This will likely bring to an end the incursion of Bob Diamond, there he is, founder of Atlas Mara Limited and former chief executive of Barclays Bank, into the African financial market after misjudging competition on the continent and apparently overpaying for some acquisitions. According to a report from Bloomberg, the London-listed company has received a number of offers for its 49.9% stake in, for instance, Union Bank of Nigeria, PLC. Rwandan President Paul Kagame says his country is in talks to establish the first mRNA vaccine plant in Africa as the continent battles the coronavirus pandemic. Kagame made this known at a virtual event this week organized by the Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness and Response. He didn't give any further details as to when exactly that plant would materialize. Zimbabwe plans to tax wildlife trade to generate revenue for the cash-strapped government. The proposal to amend the Parks and Wildlife Act suggests a 10% tax on wildlife trade, including exports and donations, where the value of the animals shipped would be estimated. The government has accused private landowners of masking animal trades as donations when they are, in fact, commercial transactions. For all of these, we're joined by Sanyade Okoli, CEO of Alpha African Advisory. Thank you so much for joining us. Good morning. Good morning. I want to get your thoughts on these reported offers that Atlas Mara is, what's your take on it and with what you've been hearing?
Well, what we know for certain, because Atlas Mara did indeed issue a press release Wednesday, that was, and they confirmed that, yes, they were in the process of disposing of about 4 of their subsidiaries,
Yes.
including Mozambique, that we know that I think Access Bank are the ones they've reached an agreement with to sell the Mozambican asset, but also Zimbabwe, we also know Botswana, et cetera, et cetera. So they're definitely working on disposing of assets, as you said.
Okay.
It's part of an overall strategic review that they
Yes.
have been undertaking for at least 18 months now, where they're essentially rationalizing their holdings and focusing on what they refer to as core markets. You're going to say something?
I love hearing you speak. Please carry on. Carry on.
So we know that's for sure. What we are not absolutely certain about is who is looking at what asset.
Aha, that's the clarity.
So when there's mention of Zenith and Access Bank, Zenith up to now, certainly within the Nigerian market, has very much pursued an organic growth strategy rather than an acquisition strategy. So I would be, in the context of them looking at Union Bank, I would be, to be honest, surprised if Zenith were looking at that one. Perhaps they're looking at some of their other foreign subsidiaries. Access Bank, I understand, has come out to say that they will not be, that it is not true. But having said that, Access Bank did say the same concerning Diamond Bank.
Exactly.
And we know how that
turned out.
Yes, but it's interesting, definitely one to watch.
Do you think Atlas Mara was a little over exuberant when they first hopped into the African continent and made their acquisitions? And because there's been reports that, well, they were a little excited, probably should have done a little more due diligence because now we've seen this exit. Does entering Africa versus getting into Asia or any other country require more due diligence than?
So here's the thing. Africa is not a country.
Right.
And all too often we speak of it or treat it as if it is. If there's one thing I've learned from my investment experience is you really need to know the market in which you're investing. So simply saying I have an Africa strategy, you're likely to get burned because you need to have a clear understanding of the individual countries that you want to invest in the continent and determine the best approach or best play in those countries. So he definitely did come in, because he had a vision, he knew what he was trying to do. But let's just say the
execution?
The biting the whole Africa elephant, I'll say, given what we're going to discuss, was not as easy to chew and swallow as he had envisaged.
Well said, well said. Vaccines, this raging debate. Well, before I get to the debate, what do you make of Mr. President Kagame saying that he wants to establish a vaccine center in Rwanda, which I think would be a first on the continent? He didn't give details though, but I just want to get your thoughts on.
From the report, you're right, it does seem quite early stage, but what is clear is that we need more vaccine producers across the world, and we certainly need more, well, we need in Africa, essentially closer to the people that, closer to the necessary markets.
Yes.
But you're going to ask about the wider...
Yes, because there's been this push. I mean, it got all the way to the United States, where yesterday, or the day before yesterday, President Biden, his trade representative said, yes, we approve, which was an about face because they didn't approve it initially, of waiving intellectual property rights for emerging markets to produce vaccines. But now Angela Merkel just came out just yesterday or so and said she's against. So I do want to get your, and she's coming from a profit perspective, saying it will disincentivize the companies who are producing it, like the Pfizers and BioNTechs of the world. So where do you come in? How do you see this whole debate?
I think the first thing I'll say is this is going to be a very interesting one for Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala.
Yes.
One of her first ones, because
exactly.
this is big and it is pertinent and it is global. It affects the whole world. Because I think if there's one thing we've learned from the whole coronavirus pandemic is that we cannot afford to act in isolation.
Right.
Because truly we do have to be our brother's keepers, because what is happening with our brothers could well end up being our own headaches. Having said that, if we break down the issue of vaccinations, there are a few broad buckets. There's one, access. Access is a big issue at the moment in terms of not enough being produced quickly enough and getting to the places we need them to
Yes.
get to. Second one is affordability.
Right.
And that's particularly relevant for the African markets, where people feel that they are not being, outside the COVAX program, not being offered at rates that suit the pockets of a lot of the African governments.
Right.
Third issue is the effectiveness, because of course we know we have several different vaccines with varying levels of effectiveness and depending on the strain as well.
Yes.
So this is not something that there's just a quick magic answer, because yes, on the one hand, we want more vaccines produced, but Angela Merkel's point is you do not want to create, you don't want to end up with unintended consequences in that it acts as a disincentive to the pharmaceutical companies, because what we have already established is that there's not just one coronavirus, it keeps mutating.
Right.
So we do need the pharmaceutical companies to continue to be working, investing in research to ensure we, as best as possible, stay ahead of the virus.
Well said, because this is an incredibly, the moral, profit arguments and so on. Thank you so much for that. Finally, a couple minutes to go. Zimbabwe, I mean, we know they've had their own issues. 10% tax on wildlife. What do you make of that?
So what it is, it's as part of a broader review of the Parks and Wildlife Act. So they're looking at the 10%, and part of what they're saying is that private sector landowners are selling off these animals and claiming that they're donations, and they're struggling to maintain all these parks, et cetera, et cetera. So they see a potential income stream. Other ideas they're considering as part of this, this review is maybe another cull, because they believe that they have more, cull of elephants, that is.
Right.
They believe they have more elephants than they can actually handle at the moment, that is having negative effects on the broader habitat, you know, just the general ecological considerations. They're also giving another quota of hunting 500 elephants per annum. So it's part of an overall review and management, wildlife management.
Fantastic stuff. CEO of Alpha African Advisory, Sanyade Okoli, as always, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your insights.
Thanks.